It began with a single line, a comeback so sharp it froze the room and left Patel speechless. And from that moment, everything changed. We watched how arrogance crumbled in the face of calm, how bluster collapsed under the weight of truth, and how dignity turned what could have been just another shouting match into a moment that will be remembered for years to come. What Patel thought would be an insult became the spark of something larger. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She spoke for millions who had been dismissed, underestimated, or silenced. She reminded us that true power lies not in shouting the loudest, but in standing firm, rooted in justice, even when the odds seem overwhelming. That is why her words struck so deeply. That is why they continue to echo. And here's the truth. This moment wasn't just about Crockett. It was about all of us, about the America we want to see. An America where voices that have long been ignored are finally heard. An America where dignity is stronger than hate. An America where truth doesn't just survive, but triumphs. But that vision only becomes reality if we carry it forward. If we refuse to let moments like this fade into the scroll of yesterday's news. So here's where you come in. If this story inspired you, if it made you proud, if it made you believe even for a moment that change is possible, don't just watch. Share it. Talk about it. Be part of the movement that says dignity wins. And if you want to keep hearing stories that challenge arrogance and uplift truth, hit subscribe, join our community, and help amplify the voices that matter. Because the fight isn't over, and together, we decide what comes next. When the storm of debate and the flood of reactions began to settle, what lingered wasn't Patel's outbursts, or even the viral memes mocking his unraveling. What endured was the clarity of Crockett's message. Words sharpened not by anger, but by conviction. In the calm after the clash, she reframed everything. Patel had tried to belittle her, to reduce her to a caricature of passion without substance. He hurled insults meant to cast her as small, as theatrical, as unworthy of the stage on which she stood. But Crockett transformed those very attacks into proof of something greater. That dignity, even under fire, is more powerful than hate. Her closing words to the chamber, replayed as often as her mic drop moment, distilled that truth. If all you can offer are insults, then you've already lost. Because this country was not built by those who shouted the loudest. It was built by those who endured, who stood tall when dignity was denied to them, and who refused to let hate define their worth. In that moment, the room itself seemed to shift. It wasn't just about her versus Patel anymore. It was about the story of America itself. The immigrant families who arrived with nothing but faith and opportunity. The black women who carried the weight of two struggles at once, yet still led movements that redefined the nation. The working people who fought for rights in the face of exploitation. Her words gathered all those threads and wove them into a tapestry of resilience. And it resonated because people knew it was true. Hate has always been loud in America, but history belongs to those who, despite the noise, choose dignity. Crockett's calm was not weakness. It was the inheritance of generations who had faced far worse and kept moving forward. Her reflection extended beyond politics. She reminded the country that the true measure of strength isn't the volume of one's voice, but the weight of one's values. You can try to tear me down, she said, but you cannot erase the people who stand with me. You cannot erase the millions who know what it feels like to be underestimated, to be disrespected, and to rise anyway. The beauty of her message lay in its universality. It wasn't just for her constituents, or for progressives, or for those watching the hearing live. It was for anyone who had ever felt dismissed, anyone who had been told they didn't belong, anyone who had been underestimated. In her words, they found validation. In her composure, they found inspiration. And this was where the moral crystallized. Patel's insults revealed his fragility, but Crockett's restraint revealed her strength. Where he sought to dominate, she chose to uplift. Where he tried to sow division, she reminded people of their shared dignity. The lesson was simple but profound. Hate may wound, but it cannot define. Dignity endures. The press framed it as a triumph of poise over arrogance. Activists quoted her in speeches about justice. Parents shared her clip with their children as a lesson in courage. And in communities across the country, her words became a kind of quiet anthem. Because at its heart, this wasn't just about a congressional hearing. It was about America's constant test. whether we will be defined by fear and cruelty or by resilience and dignity. Crockett's response answered that test, not with a shout, but with steady truth. And so the moral of the moment echoed far beyond the chamber. True strength is not in silencing others, but in standing firm when others try to silence you. True patriotism is not arrogance cloaked in power, but service rooted in justice. True victory is not humiliating an opponent, but inspiring a people. That's why the moment mattered, not because Patel faltered, but because Crockett reminded the country of what it could still be. And as the echoes of her words spread, the final reflection landed not as a partisan jab, but as an invitation that every person watching could choose dignity over hate, truth over bluster, courage over fear. That was the triumph of the day. And yet, even with the lesson clear, the story was not finished. Because every movement needs momentum, and Crockett's moment demanded one final push, an invitation for the audience themselves to carry the torch forward. The clip hit social media like a thunderclap. Within minutes of the hearing's end, snippets of Crockett's mic drop moment were already flooding Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The line that echoed across every platform, "Power without justice is tyranny," became more than just a quote. It became a rallying cry. Hashtags trended at lightning speed. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag truth over tyranny. Hashtag mic drop moment. By evening, hashtag Crockett vs. Patel was the #1 trending topic nationwide. Meme accounts wasted no time, splicing Patel's stunned silence with reaction gifs of celebrities shaking their heads or dropping popcorn. One viral edit showed Crockett's words echoing over footage of civil rights marches, tying her moment directly to a larger legacy of speaking truth to power. But it wasn't just internet humor, it was a cultural moment. Progressive commentators lit up the airwaves. What we saw today was dignity refusing to bow. One anchor declared on a primetime show, "In a political climate where shouting often replaces substance, Crockett reminded us that composure, backed by truth, dismantles arrogance more effectively than any insult ever could." Celebrities chimed in too. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Representative Jasmine Crockett just gave us the scene of the year. Calm, cutting, historic." Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote, "This is why representation matters. This is why we vote. Hashtag truth over tyranny." Even athletes, usually cautious in political arena, reposted clips with captions like, "That's how you handle arrogance." Meanwhile, Patel's defenders scrambled. Right-wing commentators tried to paint Crockett as disrespectful, but the effort backfired. Users flooded their feeds with clips of Patel's interruptions, comparing them against Crockett's steady demeanor. The contrast was undeniable. One man flustered and flailing, one woman grounded and unshaken. The shockwaves extended beyond the internet. In communities across the country, Crockett's words sparked conversations. At barbershops in Detroit, at college campuses in California, in immigrant-owned corner stores in New York, people replayed the clip on their phones, nodding with a mix of pride and vindication. For many, it wasn't just about her versus Patel. It was about seeing themselves, their struggles, their resilience, reflected in a chamber where they were too often invisible. Cable news networks devoted entire segments to the exchange, replaying it with slow-motion cuts and panel analysis. One commentator marveled, "It's not just what she said, it's how she said it. The pauses, the precision. She owned the silence as much as the words. That's leadership." Another observed, "We might be witnessing the rise of a new national figure. Mark my words, this moment will follow her into every future election." And the numbers backed it up. Crockett's follower count tripled overnight. Donations to her campaign spiked so dramatically that her website temporarily crashed. Political action committees aligned with her causes reported surges in small-dollar contributions. But the true measure of the moment wasn't in numbers or trends. It was in the stories people began sharing beneath her viral clip. "My parents came here with nothing, and today I watched someone speak for them." One comment read, "She made me believe again." Another said, "As a black woman in corporate America, I've been silenced in rooms full of men like Patel. Seeing her stand tall, it felt like she was standing for me." And still, the ripples spread further. Late-night shows opened with jokes at Patel's expense, replaying his stammering responses. Satirical skits depicted him being reduced to silence, while Crockett's words echoed like a soundtrack of justice. What was once a routine congressional hearing had transformed into a pop culture event, a metaphor for the larger battle over whose voices define America's story. For Patel, the fallout was brutal. Clips of his shaken expression became instant reaction memes. Headlines questioned whether his credibility had been permanently damaged. One pundit quipped, "He came to the hearing to flex his insider credentials, and he left as a face of fragility." But for Crockett, the narrative was entirely different. She wasn't just trending, she was being elevated. Thought pieces hailed her as a new symbol of courage in politics. Activist groups began citing her words in rallies. Churches replayed her clip during sermons about truth and integrity. Teachers showed it in classrooms as an example of speaking truth to power. The country was captivated, but the debate was far from over. As Crockett's star rose, critics prepared their counterattacks, determined to spin the story back in their favor. Allies whispered that bigger stages awaited her. Supporters demanded she keep pressing forward. The question now wasn't whether she had won the moment. It was how far the moment would carry her. Because while one clip had already set the internet ablaze, what came next promised to ignite an even deeper reckoning. And as America argued, laughed, and shared the clip millions of times over, one truth became undeniable. The battle lines had been redrawn, but the storm that followed, that was only just beginning. The chamber was already humming with tension, a low buzz of disbelief at what they were witnessing. Patel leaned in, his face flushed, his voice desperate as he tried to retake ground. "Congresswoman, you can posture all you want, but at the end of the day, the facts don't lie. I was in the room where decisions were made. I know how power works. You're just another loud voice trying to make a name for yourself." The insult lingered in the air like smoke. A few of Patel's allies smirked, confident he'd finally cornered her. But Crockett didn't blink. She didn't even shift in her chair. She simply let the silence stretch, the weight of his arrogance hanging heavy. Her pause wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. She leaned forward, voice quiet but razor sharp. "You want to talk about facts, Mr. Patel? Fine, let's talk about them." The room leaned in. Cameras tightened their focus. This was the moment everyone sensed was coming, though no one could predict exactly how it would unfold. Crockett reached for a stack of papers before her, slowly, deliberately. She didn't rush. Every movement was calculated, every pause purposeful. "You say you were in the room where decisions were made." "Yes, you were. And those decisions destroyed lives. You were part of an administration that ripped children from their parents at the border, that turned cruelty into official policy. That's not power, Mr. Patel. That's abuse." Patel's expression tightened, but before he could interject, Crockett raised her hand slightly, silencing him without ever raising her voice. "You talk about knowing how power works. Let me tell you what real power looks like. Real power is a single mother in my district working 3 jobs, but still finding time to come to a city council meeting and demand clean water for her children. Real power is an immigrant family terrified of IC raids, still stepping into my office because they believe this country owes them fairness. Real power is a people, ordinary, unglamorous, resilient people who don't have lobbyists or million-dollar salaries, but who keep America alive every single day." The chamber erupted with murmurs, some nodding, others scribbling furiously. Patel's lips parted as if to respond, but he faltered. The confident smirk that had carried him through earlier jabs was gone. Crockett pressed forward, her cadence steady, her tone rising just enough to fill the room. "You mock me for being a loud voice. You're right about one thing. I am loud. Because I have to be. Because for centuries, people who look like me, people who came from where I came from, have been silenced. And I refuse to let that silence continue in these halls." A pause, intentional, magnetic. The silence was deafening. Even the shuffle of papers stopped. Then, with surgical precision, she delivered the blow that would ricochet across the nation. "You say I don't know how power works. But I know this. Power without justice is tyranny. And what you represent is not strength. It is cowardice dressed up as authority." Gasp shot through the gallery. Patel shifted in his chair. his face darkening, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself. The cameras caught every flicker of discomfort, every sign of unraveling. But Crockett wasn't done. Her voice grew stronger, resonant, carrying the weight of history. You sit there, invoking your titles, your connections, your so-called insider knowledge, as if that makes you the gatekeeper of truth. But the truth is this: your power is always dependent on keeping others down, on building walls, on sowing fear, on silencing dissent. And here's the part you can't stand. You can't silence me. You can't silence the millions I represent. We are here, and we are not going anywhere. The gallery erupted in applause, spontaneous and unstoppable. The chair tried to gavel the room back to order, but the energy was too explosive. Phones shot into the air, capturing history in real time. The hashtags were already being typed. Patel attempted a rebuttal, his voice rising above the clamor. This is all rhetoric, empty rhetoric. You think speeches change the world? That's naive. Crockett turned toward him slowly, her expression unshaken. She lowered her voice, forcing everyone to lean in once more. You call it rhetoric. I call it truth. And here's the difference between us. You hide behind power. I speak for the powerless. You protect privilege. I fight for possibility. And deep down, you know which one will last. It was a masterstroke. By lowering her voice, she commanded the room more completely than Patel had managed even by shouting. Every word etched itself into the atmosphere, like it had always belonged there. Patel sputtered, searching for footing, his once polished responses collapsing into half-formed retorts. You don't understand. You're twisting. But the audience wasn't listening anymore. Their attention was locked on Crockett, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and vindication. And then came the final, devastating line, the true mic drop. Crockett leaned forward, eyes locked on Patel, her word precise, deliberate, undeniable. History will not remember you as a man of courage. It will not remember you as a defender of truth. It will remember you as a footnote to a failed era. And it will remember that when you tried to shout us down, we answered back, and we did not flinch. The room exploded. Applause thundered. Even members of the committee who had remained stoic until now couldn't suppress their reactions. The chair pounded the gavel, shouting for order, but no one cared. The eruption of energy, of validation, of catharsis was unstoppable. Patel sank back in his chair, eyes darting, mouth tight, his aura of dominance shattered. His attempt to reframe himself as the master of the room had collapsed under the weight of Crockett's words. He looked smaller now, diminished, not by her insults, but by her truth. And Crockett, composed yet burning with quiet fire, adjusted her microphone. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to repeat herself. The silence that followed her words was a victory. For those watching live, the moment felt cinematic. For those scrolling through clips later, it became immortal. Patel had tried to dominate. Crockett had redefined the battlefield. And as the noise slowly subsided, the entire country could sense it. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a mic drop. It was a turning point. But what no one yet knew was how far the shockwaves would reach. Because the debate was no longer just about Patel versus Crockett. It was about America's future. And the fight had only just begun. The opening clash had already electrified the room. But what followed was even more charged. Patel, still smarting from Crockett's opening strike, leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he tried to reassert control. With all due respect, Congresswoman, he sneered. Maybe if you focus less on theatrics and more on facts, we could have a serious conversation. It was a classic move. Dismiss her as emotional, frame her as unprepared, reduce her to a caricature rather than engage her arguments. Patel's allies nodded approvingly, but the effect was far from what he intended. Because as the tension ratcheted higher, Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She let the silence stretch, her gaze fixed, her expression steady, until his words seemed to echo into their own emptiness. And then, calmly, she responded, "Facts? That's rich, coming from someone whose record has been built on twisting them." The words landed like a stone thrown into still water, ripples of murmur spreading across the chamber. Patel bristled. He interrupted again, his tone sharper, his volume rising. Don't you dare question my record. I served this country at the highest levels. What have you done, besides grandstanding for cameras? The insult was meant to sting, but Crockett's composure turned it against him. She simply folded her hands, leaned back slightly, and replied with quiet conviction. What I've done is fight for people who don't have the privilege of walking these halls with power already in their pocket. What I've done is represent voices you've spent your career ignoring. That contrast was devastating. Every time Patel raised his voice, Crockett's restraint exposed his desperation. Every insult he hurled revealed his need to dominate, and every calm rebuttal from her highlighted the hollowness of his arrogance. The tension grew so thick that even members of the committee shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The escalation wasn't just verbal, it was visible. Patel gestured wildly, papers rattling in his hands, his frustration mounting as Crockett refused to meet his fire with fire. His strategy depended on rattling her. But her calm became a mirror reflecting his own insecurity. The more he pressed, the more he appeared cornered. Spectators in the gallery leaned forward, phones in hand, capturing every moment. Online, live streams began to buzz with commentary. Patel's losing it. One user typed, "Crockett is ice cold. Absolute queen," wrote another. The clash had spilled beyond the walls of the chamber, and the world was taking sides. Patel tried one final angle, dripping with condescension. "Congresswoman, maybe if you had real-world experience instead of courtroom theatrics, you'd understand how serious these issues are." It was a wrong move. Crockett's eyes narrowed just slightly, her tone steady but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Mr. Patel, my theatrics have been standing between families and deportation. My theatrics have kept innocent people from being crushed by a system you helped enable. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it should." The silence that followed was louder than any insult. For a moment, even Patel seemed stunned, his mouth opening as if to respond, but no words coming out. Around the room, heads turned, eyes widened, the balance had shifted once more, and it was clear to everyone watching. Still, Patel wasn't ready to concede. He raised his voice, trying to bulldoze a moment, but now his tone carried a shrillness it hadn't before. He sounded less like the confident operative he wanted to project, and more like a man scrambling to keep his grip on authority. The harder he pushed, the weaker he seemed. Crockett, meanwhile, remained composed, her every word deliberate, her every pause measured. She didn't just debate him. She dismantled him piece by piece, showing the stark difference between arrogance and dignity, between bluster and truth. By the time the exchange slowed, the roles were unmistakably reversed. Patel, who had entered the hearing certain of his dominance, looked flustered, his authority slipping with each attempt to regain it. Crockett, calm and resolute, stood taller without ever leaving her seat. And yet, the clash was still far from over, because the moment everyone would remember most, the one destined to dominate headlines and social feeds, hadn't even happened yet. The room was on edge, waiting, knowing something monumental was about to unfold. What came next would not just silence Patel. It would set the internet ablaze and cement Crockett's place as the people's champion. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's words hit with such force, you have to know who she is. Not just a congresswoman with a sharp tongue and piercing stare, but the story that shaped her into the fighter America saw that day. Because Crockett did not come from the corridors of privilege or the polished grooming of a political dynasty. She came from grit, from sacrifice, from a life that mirrored the struggles of the very people she now represents. Her journey began in St. Louis, raised in a working-class family where opportunity was something you fought for, not something handed down. She grew up with a mother who worked long hours, balancing bills with the same precision she balanced her children's hopes. The lessons came early. If you want dignity, you stand up for it. If you want progress, you fight for it. Those lessons became the foundation of everything Jasmine Crockett would become. When she left home to pursue her education, she didn't walk an easy road. She took on the weight of student loans, part-time jobs, and the constant reminder that people like her weren't expected to break into the highest echelons of power. But she refused to internalize that ceiling. She studied law not as a stepping stone to wealth, but as a weapon for justice. She saw firsthand how communities of color were too often left defenseless against a system designed to exploit them, and she made a choice. She would be their advocate. Crockett's legal career wasn't cushioned in corporate offices or prestige-driven firms. She spent her days in crowded courtrooms, defending clients who couldn't afford the lawyers that corporations could hire with ease. Immigrants fighting deportation, families facing eviction, young people criminalized for mistakes that wealthy kids could escape. These are the faces that shaped her. She didn't just represent them. She carried their stories, their fears, their dignity into every battle. It was in those trenches that she developed the steel, composure the world would later see on Capitol Hill. When you had to look a mother in the eye and explain how the system stacked against her child, the smirk of a political operative loses its sting. When you've had to stand against prosecutors who assume your client's guilt before evidence is heard, the arrogance of a man like Patel feels all too familiar and all too beatable. Her identity, too, became central to her fight. As a black woman in America, Crockett knew she would be doubted, underestimated, even dismissed before she opened her mouth. She wore that reality like armor. Every sneer she faced in a courtroom, every patronizing comment tossed her way in political spaces, only sharpened her resolve. She knew she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for generations told they were too loud, too angry, too much. And when she spoke, it wasn't only her voice echoing, it was theirs. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett had already built a reputation for fearlessness. But it wasn't recklessness. It was conviction. Her campaigns weren't fueled by billionaire donations, but by grassroots energy. Teachers, nurses, immigrants, and working parents who saw in her someone who would actually carry their burdens into the halls of power. She became, in their eyes, not just a representative, but a champion. That immigrant-friendly identity framing wasn't political convenience. It was lived solidarity. Crockett had spent years standing beside families fighting for a chance to stay in America, watching as their dignity was trampled in courtrooms where power rarely tilted in their favor. She knew their pain because she had chosen to share it, and she carried their stories to Washington as part of her own. In the committee room facing Patel, all of this came into focus. He saw an opponent to be belittled, a woman to be dismissed. But what he didn't see, what he could never understand, was the army of stories, sacrifices, and struggles that stood behind her. He was looking at one person. The country saw something far larger. It was the calm she projected that told the story. She didn't need to shout to command respect. She didn't need to perform outrage to prove her point. Every measured word, every steady glance, carried the weight of a lifetime spent fighting battles Patel had never even acknowledged. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. His arrogance versus her dignity, his bluster against her lived truth. And this is why that opening clash mattered. Because Crockett didn't just represent herself in that moment. She represented every child told they weren't good enough, every immigrant told they didn't belong, every working family told the system wasn't built for them. Her presence was proof that the voices once silenced could not only enter the room, but dominate it. For Patel, this was supposed to be another performance. For Crockett, it was a continuation of a lifelong struggle. And that difference, the depth of her conviction versus the hollowness of his arrogance, would become a deciding factor in everything that followed. As she gathered her papers that day, composure radiating like quiet fire, the room felt it. This wasn't just a congresswoman. This was the people's champion, carrying the weight of dignity into battle against contempt. And while Patel prepared his counterattack, ready to unleash his familiar tactics of ridicule and disruption, what he didn't know was that Crockett had been preparing for men like him her entire life. The showdown was only beginning, and the balance of power was about to tilt in a way no one expected. To understand why this confrontation landed with such force, you have to look closely at the man who sat across from Jasmine Crockett. Kash Patel wasn't just another witness summoned to give testimony. He carried with him a reputation built inside the most polarizing political machine of the last decade, a career woven from loyalty, ambition, and a willingness to bend reality to fit the needs of his patrons. Patel's rise was meteoric by Washington standards. A lawyer by training, he began his career in government with the kind of quiet diligence that rarely makes headlines. But once he aligned himself with Donald Trump's orbit, his trajectory shifted dramatically. He became more than an advisor. He became a soldier in the wars Trump waged against institutions, norms, and anyone who dared challenge him. To supporters, Patel was clever and unflinching, the kind of operative who knew how to play hardball. To critics, he was something far less flattering, a man who treated the truth as an inconvenience, whose loyalty was to power itself rather than principle. This wasn't just perception. His record bore out. In his time on the House Intelligence Committee staff, Patel had pushed theories so far-fetched that even seasoned operatives raised eyebrows. He positioned himself as a truth-teller exposing corruption, but more often than not, his revelations unraveled under scrutiny. When later elevated to senior positions in the Trump administration, Patel's penchant for spin only grew bolder. He presented himself as a defender of America, but his critics saw him as someone willing to undermine the very systems meant to protect it. And it was this contradiction, the self-image of fearless patriot against a record of partisan maneuvering, that defined Patel in the public imagination. He projected confidence, striding into hearings with the smug grin of a man convinced that he could outweed his opponents with sheer bravado. But beneath that surface was a pattern of half-truths, evasions, and calculated deflections. He thrived on spectacle, knowing that in an age of viral clips, bluster often mattered more than substance. That day in the committee room, Patel leaned hard on the same tactics. He interrupted. He smirked. He spoke in the clipped tones of someone rehearsed in dismissing his critics. It wasn't just arrogance. It was strategy. He understood that if he could rattle his questioners, if he could make them seem emotional or unprepared, he could tilt the optics in his favor. But Patel underestimated Jasmine Crockett. Where others might have stumbled under his interruptions, she remained steady. Where he tried to bulldoze, she pushed back with calm precision. And that contrast was devastating. Because the more Patel blustered, the smaller he seemed in comparison to her composure. It wasn't only his arrogance on display, it was his hypocrisy. Here was a man who had spent years decrying political theater, yet he performed for the cameras with every sarcastic sigh and exaggerated shrug. Here was a man who demanded respect for institutions, yet spent much of his career undermining them when they dared to check his allies. And here was a man who painted himself as the voice of ordinary Americans, yet carried himself with the entitlement of someone who believed accountability was beneath him. The contradictions stacked up. Patel often claimed to value transparency, yet his testimony was littered with evasions. He spoke of patriotism, yet aligned himself with actions that critics argued weakened the very democracy he professed to defend. He boasted of his legal expertise, yet relied on rhetorical tricks rather than substance when cornered. This is why the showdown mattered so deeply. Because Patel wasn't just a man with a resume, he was a symbol. To many, he represented an entire wing of politics that thrived on manipulation, one that treated oversight as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. His swagger was meant to intimidate, his words to distract. But in Crockett, he found an opponent unwilling to play by those rules. The image of him shuffling his papers after her opening shot told the story better than any commentary could. For once, the smirk didn't hold. For once, the confidence cracked. And that moment of hesitation revealed something profound. Bluster only works until it collides with dignity. Yet Patel wasn't finished. He had built his career on comebacks, on spinning defeats into performances of strength. And as the hearing pressed forward, he gathered himself, ready to unleash a barrage that he hoped would reassert control. But what Patel didn't realize, and what the country was about to witness, was that his usual tactics were no match for Crockett's unshakable calm. The very contradictions that had defined his career were about to become the cracks through which his authority slipped away. And as Patel prepared to strike back, the air in the room thickened. Everyone could feel it. The clash was far from over. The real test was still to come, and it would push both figures to the edge of their limits. Why did this clash matter? Why did a single exchange in a crowded committee room capture so much attention? To answer that, you have to see the stage for what it was. Not just a hearing, not just a spat between two personalities, but a reflection of America's deepest struggles over dignity, representation, and who gets to write the nation's story. Kash Patel came into hearing cloaked in the confidence of someone who had walked the inner halls of power under the Trump administration. To his allies, he was a loyal soldier. To critics, a partisan operative who treated truth as something malleable, something to be bent for convenience. He wasn't just another witness. He symbolized a politics that thrived on bluster, on dismissing dissent, on reducing oversight to a stage for personal grievance. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman who embodied an entirely different narrative. Young, black, and unapologetically outspoken, she represented a generation that had grown up watching politics leave too many communities behind. To her, oversight wasn't performance, it was accountability. Her very presence challenged a system long dominated by men who looked, talked, and acted like Patel. The hearing was supposed to be about dry procedure, but in reality, it was about something much larger. Who holds power in America and whose voices are silenced? Every insult, every interruption, every dismissive glance carried weight. When Patel tried to wave her off with condescension, it wasn't just an attack on her. It echoed centuries of dismissal directed at women, at people of color, at anyone who dared step outside the roles written for them. And that's why Crockett's sharp retort resonated so deeply. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a voice of a new America pushing back against the old. It was a reminder that politics is not the private playground of the powerful, but the public square of the people. In that room, she carried the frustrations of millions who had been told to wait their turn, to lower their voice, to accept disrespect as a cost of participation. The stakes, then, were nothing less than the image of American democracy itself. Would it remain a theater where arrogance went unchallenged, or could it transform into a space where dignity triumphed, even against those who once wielded unchecked authority? Commentators outside the chamber sensed it too. Journalists typed frantically, social media feeds lit up, and whispers spread that something extraordinary was unfolding. Viewers who had tuned in expecting another tedious exchange suddenly sat up, leaning closer to their screens. They weren't just watching a hearing anymore. They were witnessing a moment that tapped into the heartbeat of America's identity crisis. And the tension only grew, because Crockett's words, as sharp as they were only the beginning. The room was on edge, the silence before the storm. Everyone there knew Patel would fire back. The question was how, and whether Crockett could withstand the full force of his retaliation. The hearing had become more than a test of policy or oversight. It was now a test of resolve, of who could embody the values America claimed to stand for. And as Patel gathered himself for his next move, those watching sensed a turning point coming. What unfolded in the following minutes wouldn't just expose a clash between two individuals. It would reveal the deeper battle over whether truth and dignity could survive in the face of arrogance and contempt. And that next exchange, that was where everything would change. It happened in a flash, the kind of moment that sears itself into political memory. The committee room, once buzzing with the usual chatter of staffers and half-hearted note-taking, went pin-drop silent as Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice sharp as a blade. "Mr. Patel," she began, eyes locked with a former Trump official across the table, "I don't know if you came here to play games, but let me make one thing clear. This is not a circus, and I am not your clown." The words sliced through the air, heavy with truth and defiance. For a split second, the cameras caught it. Patel blinking, his confident smirk faltering, his rehearsed talking points collapsing under the weight of Crockett's unflinching stare. The audience, both inside the room and millions watching online, felt that jolt, that unmistakable electricity of a moment unscripted, unfiltered, and undeniable. Gasps rippled from the gallery. A staffer dropped a pen. Somewhere in the back, a stifled laugh broke the tension, but Crockett's gaze never wavered. She wasn't here for theatrics. She was here for accountability, for dignity, for the kind of truth that makes the powerful squirm. Patel tried to recover, shuffling papers, muttering something about respect and procedure. But respect, in that instant, had already shifted. It was in the hands of the self-styled insider, who thought his past titles gave him the upper hand. It was firmly with the woman who dared to speak what so many were thinking, that America had grown tired of arrogance masquerading as authority. The clip would spread like wildfire before the hearing even adjourned, but in that room, in that frozen heartbeat of silence, everyone knew something had shifted. This wasn't just another hearing destined to fade into obscurity. This was a clash of worlds, of visions, of America's future. And as Crockett straightened her papers with quiet composure, a storm was already building. What came next wouldn't just challenge Patel. It would shake the entire conversation about power, truth, and who gets to define the American story. Because if that opening line left the room stunned, the next exchange would leave the whole country in disbelief.